Hi there, my happy painters. Today we're going to be working on a beautiful winter scene. The theme of our scene is working on showing that beautiful winter sun. And for this particular one, I'm actually showing you how sometimes I'll start off and divide my canvas into quadrants of 3, so it ends up being in 9 pieces. So basically you measure out your canvas, divide by 3 lengthwise and widthwise, and then you end up with 9 equal squares. This is a method that actually quite a few artists use, and what it does is it helps you to identify areas where you should really try to have your focal points. And focal points are usually at the intersection of your lines. So I'm just kind of drawing this out right now. Doesn't have to be 100% accurate. I mean, it's really just a guideline. But when you start doing this on a regular basis, you'll start to notice that your work does improve because you are now focusing more on the composition. So now we're going to draw out our composition, and I'm just looking at the angles in the reference photo, and I'm also pointing out areas where we're going to have our focal points. So I'm drawing the line. There's a path that you can see on your reference photo. It's covered in snow, but you can definitely see the snowbank area on the left side where the snow is higher where the trees are and lower where the actual pathway is. I'm putting that in now, and I'm making sure that that curve intersects at that point right there that I've circled. And that's going to be one of my focal points where I'm going to have the lightest light in my composition. And now I'm placing my trees, and again you can use those lines that we put in the beginning as a reference to placing your trees. Now remember, when we use an image, if we're not outside painting and we're using an image, a photograph, 99% of the time that photograph is not going to be in a really good compositional way for you to just take it and copy it exact. You're going to need to edit it and move some of the things around, move your trees around, move the angle of the pathways, things like that, in order to plan out a really solid composition. The other thing I'm going to be doing as well, if you look at your reference image, there are a lot of trees in that image. I'm not going to be doing every single tree. I'm picking and choosing which trees I want to have in the composition. Sometimes when you oversaturate your composition with too much going on, it gets too busy, and it's really hard for the viewer to determine exactly what it is that you were trying to achieve. So decide beforehand when you're looking at your image what your plan is. What do you really want to focus on? In this particular one, my focus is going to be on showing that beautiful, brilliant winter sun, which is so much different than the summertime sun. You can choose to follow that along with me today, or maybe you want to pick a tree or an area on the pathway that you really want to tell a story about. So decide ahead of time when you're looking at your picture and your reference photo, or if you're outside and you're looking around, look at something, decide on where the story is, what grabs your attention, and what story do you want to tell. these are the angles here that I've created. We've got the angles of the trees going up and down. We've got angles pointing towards our focal point, and we've got the angles of the branches coming down and away. So these are areas that are all going to work together to leave the eye around our canvas. I've got a medium-sized brush right now, and I'm going to load it up with some of our cobalt and white, and we're just going to block in the sky in around these main tree branches that we've drawn in. Now remember, when you draw your trees in, don't draw every single little branch. We're just putting in the main trunks and the main heavier branches. And then towards the end, we add in the smaller branches. And the main branches are just there to kind of give us a guideline as to where we want things to go. So this part is fairly meditative because you're basically just kind of blocking in a color. We're going to work on having the darker area over to the left, and then gradually working towards a lighter area in the sky as we move towards the right. I'm putting in a white area that you often find, and I've talked about this in the other winter workshops, when you're looking at the horizon in the wintertime, there's sort of a haze in between the furthest thing in the horizon and the sky. So it's sort of especially in the morning, you've got that coolness of the earth is kind of coming up, meeting the warmness of the sun. So it's a bit of a lighter area, and I'm just putting that in right now, and I'm going to blend it through a little bit into the sky. And as you can see, our sky is lighter over to the right and darker towards the left. Again, you can change however you want your composition to go. I've got the shadow of the trees coming down towards us, so the light is actually coming from the left-hand side. The sun is shining from the top left down towards the bottom right. And that's pretty much what we've got in our image. And if you want to change things up and move around where the sun is coming from, definitely do that. That is your choice as the artist. So at this point, we're going to begin working on the shadows. And if you've ever, again, watched my videos, watched my workshops, each time I do something a little bit different. Sometimes I'll start with the highlights first. Sometimes I'll start with the shadows first. I just like to change it up. For me, it's all about the process, and it's how I'm feeling at the time and what is speaking to me the most at the time that I'm working on this. So For me right now, I really wanted to get those shadows in, mostly because I want to make sure I get these right, because they are dipping down. If you ever look at the shadow where the edge is, it sort of comes down straight and then comes off into the distance towards you. So I'm just roughing that in, and I'm not going too dark right away. It's kind of the same blue that we've got in the sky that I'm putting through here, and it's just so that I don't lose track of where those shadows are, because the shadows speaking together along with the sunlight that we put in later are what's going to tell the story about the brilliance of the sun and how it interacts with the snow. So if you've noticed, I've also added some shadows from trees that are not in our composition. And sometimes there'll be things that are far away off of the edges that we can't see, but their shadow still affects our composition, and we can decide if we want to use that or if we don't want to include that in the composition. So now we're going to go in and we're going to find those highlight areas where the sun is super brilliant on the snow, and we're going to put those in. And again, this is just a blocking in stage, so no details are required. We're just laying down color, indicating areas that we want to have as lighter areas. And I'm using a mix of the Azo yellow mixed with our titanium white. And as you can see, that little focal point that we've got in that top right corner that we indicated earlier is the more brilliant yellow. And then the other areas I've faded out with a bit more of the white. It can be a little bit tricky when you're using yellow so close to blue, especially if your blue is still wet, because you run the risk of creating green. So the areas where I'm adding it onto the blue, I'm just kind of dotting it in because I don't want to have green going on. If you end up with green, don't worry, it is totally fixable. You can either wait a day or two for that area to dry and then go over top again with the color that you really want, or you can add a neutral in there, which would be your brown, and that will help get rid of the green. So I'm just continuing on identifying areas that have that nice brilliant yellow color. Now, as you know, I like to use yellow a lot in my paintings to identify where the sun is brightest. If you prefer a different color, certainly go ahead and use the color that is your preference. So I'm pretty happy with the highlights. I'm going to go take some of that, it's kind of a reddish orangey color for that far away distant area. I'm going to put that in. And this is just an area off in the distance. There's a few trees in there, there's some bushes in there. I just want to indicate that there is more foliage going on back here, but it's not part of our story, so we're not going to worry about a lot of the detail. It's basically just blocking in that color. And keep in mind when you're doing this, the areas that are on the left side are closer to you, so you want to have that color darker, and then the areas off to the right are further away, so that color should be lighter. And I have done it a little bit too dark in this one off to the right, but that's easy enough to go back in and add some white and thin it out, make it a little bit quieter further away. I'm just taking a palette knife at this point and I'm pulling on that paint upwards towards our sky just to indicate a few branches and treetops sticking out of the main tree line. Didn't want it to be a super solid line. I just wanted it to show that there's some trees back there and other things going on. Palette knives are really great tools. Don't be afraid to experiment with your palette knife and try different things, different textures. A lot of times I'll go back in after a painting is completely done and just scrape through the layers to reveal layers underneath and little bits of color, especially if you're doing tree branches or grasses or things like that. It's kind of a nice idea to just cut away that area. So now I've mixed up some of my brown, my umber, and I am adding it into the bottom edge. If you ever look at a tree line, you'll see that right where the trees meet the earth, there's a bit of a shadow. And obviously that's because the sun doesn't penetrate all the way down to that area. And so the trees are creating a shadow between it and the ground below. So I'm just putting that in. And of course making it fainter and smaller as we go further off to the right side in the distance. I'm being brave using the same brush, but you could technically switch up your brush to something smaller. So now I'm using that same darker color and I'm adding in some deeper shadows. Basically the footsteps in the snow, you know, when you step on the snow and it kind of leaves like a footstep imprint. So I'm putting those in And I'm also going to work on that edge where the snow drops down in towards the pathway. And because our blue that we put on there earlier is still wet, it's easy enough for me to work it in a little bit. One thing I've really been working on recently is not to overblend. Back in the day, I used to do a lot of blending. I thought everything had to be blended perfectly and nice and smooth. And I'm learning now that actually having just brush strokes of color dotted in through the work really gives your work that really cool perspective and more of a painterly look. And it's something I'm really starting to enjoy and really getting into. So if you've ever been following my work, you'll see that the style has certainly changed. And I've been sharing that with you as we go along with the new style of painting. So I hope you're truly enjoying these. So I've got some of the lighter snow areas that I'm putting in now. And it looks white on your camera, but I'm not actually using a pure white. There still is, I've got a teeny tiny little bit of the brown mixed in just to sort of neutralize the snow color. And then there's still a little teeny bit of the blue. And I'm actually using the same brush that I was using when I did all the blue areas. And again, at this point, we're still just blocking in colors, blocking in areas. Just working around that tree trunk. And I'm also varying the brush work. I'm not moving my brush in the same direction, holding it the same way. I'm flipping it around, using different edges. That all adds to the interest on your canvas. got a lot of the snow areas filled in now on that top left area. Gonna start to define the edge that drops down. Just mixing up some darker color on, again, another flat brush, and it's not too big, but it's not too small either. Sort of a medium, I believe it's a 12 or a 14 size brush that I'm using. And I just want to put that edge in, but I don't want the edge to be solid because, as we know, snow melts and it moves around with the wind. So I want that edge to really mimic the naturalness of a snow edge that you would find along a partially cleared pathway. And then because this is basically a vertical form, you don't get the sun hitting it. So it's going to be a darker area. So I'm just pulling that down and working that through. And you get some really nice instant contrast happening with the snow on the top edge where the sun is hitting that snow, and then you've got the shadow of that drop. In the foreground, I'm making it a little larger, just pulling that shadow across a little more, just to emphasize that this is in the foreground. Using some of that darker color in through some of the shadows of the trees going across. And like I said, keep your edges sketchy and blotchy, pulling it across into the pathway as well. I've changed back to my lighter colored brush. It already has some of the lighter snow that we used in the top left. And now I'm putting that through into the bottom area. Now this bottom area, I'm going to make it a little bit darker than that top area for the most part, just to indicate that it's an indent that we're walking along that pathway. In the foreground, I want to keep it really rough and textured, heavy textures. Again, it indicates more of something that's in the foreground. Anything that we put into the background is going to have less detail. It's going to be blurrier. Just working those colors through. And don't be afraid at this point. Don't be afraid to touch the edges of the paint that's already on there and pull it through what you're putting down. It's the advantage of using oil paint. People talk about oil paint and they go, oh, I hate how it takes so long to dry. Once you learn to use that to your advantage, you will actually start to really love oil paint. And it's my favorite thing about oil paint is how it's so fluid and flowy, how I can push things around. There's no other way to describe it. You're pushing the paint around on the canvas and you're pulling colors from one area to the next. These shapes that we're creating here are quite abstract. So don't be afraid to change it up and try new things. we're ready now to start working on our trees. And I'm mixing up a lighter color of brown. I'm mixing in some of my walnut oil with it because we want to start off thin first. Remember, the rule is thick over thin, so your lower layers should always be thinner, and that allows you to add thicker layers on top later. So I'm mixing up some umber with a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, some white because I don't want it too dark at first. And I'm just going to work on those trees. So as we work on the trees into the background, they're going to get lighter in color, and I'm allowing those upper branches to almost disappear into the sky, and that will give an indication of a tree that's quite tall, that the branches are far enough up that they sort of disappear out of your vision. Normally I would do 3 trees. There was an actual tree, if you see in the one in the far background, it's kind of a 2 twin trees together, and I decided to include them because I thought they were kind of cool. And I'm just adding in branches, deciding how many I want, taking my time, stepping back, taking a look. Next, I'm adding in that dark shadowy area of the tree that's furthest away from the sun. And this is not black that I'm using, this is actually a mix of the Prussian blue with the brown. And it's fairly dark because, like I just said, the light is not reaching this area at all. Well, I have some of that darker color on my brush. I'm going to use it to go back into these shadows and just deepen them down, especially right at the crease where the edge of the snow meets the path area. So at this point, I'm just using a dry brush to soften those edges in the trees a little bit, where the lightest areas and the darkest areas meet. I didn't want to soften them too much, and I didn't want them too sharp. So some of the areas I'm going to blur together, and other of the areas I'm just going to leave it as is. And I'm doing the same in the background. Finding as I look at it, the edges are a little too sharp, so I just want to kind of blur those together, especially in the foreground, or the background, sorry, the background areas should be a little bit more blurry. And we're dotting in our pine tree. I'm not using an actual green. I've mixed up a green with my blue and my yellow. Added a little bit of the brown to neutralize the color. I don't want it to be a super brilliant green. Now sometimes I know you've seen me use the fan brush for making trees like this. Right now I'm just using an older brush that's kind of all splayed on the end. It's further in the distance, so I don't want it to have a whole lot of distinction. I want it to be fuzzy-ish looking on the edges. I don't want it to be super clear. I wasn't sure if I was going to add this tree when I was looking at the initial reference image, but I just kind of felt when I got to that point in the painting that there was something missing there at the end of the trail. It just felt like it was heading off into nowhere. So adding the tree, I think, really gave it some balance. So I just darkened up that foreground area because I wanted the tree, the darkness of the tree, to be balanced out. It was too heavy. So putting more dark in that foreground area kind of gave us more balance. It's important when you're looking at your composition to try to balance out the areas that you have in there. Like I said, I didn't want it too heavy back there because your eye would automatically be drawn to that dark area and would just kind of stick there really. So we've got some balance going on now. So at this point I decided to try drawing in a few thin branches with it's a flat brush. It's just a smaller flat brush. And I mixed up a lighter color because I had considered filling in the sky with more branches, but as I was going along I really felt that it was just going to take away from the feeling of the work. So I ended up not really adding in too many of these. Just added a few. Again, because this is your painting, this is your work, if you want to add in more of those little branches and fill up the sky with branches, certainly do that. I mean, you don't know unless you try, right? Try it. It turns out that you hate it. Let it dry for a few days, come back to it and paint over the branches that you put in. So I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out. It's time for me to sign my work. I encourage you all to always sign your work. It doesn't matter if you're 100% happy with it. Put your name on it. Just shows that it's something that you've done. It's all a learning process. I hope you've enjoyed the workshop today, and again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I can help you out. I'm going to be working on some Zoom classes very soon for groups, so stay tuned for that announcement. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.